go ahead and make our way over to Acts chapter 25. I appreciate being here. Obviously, it's a little different. We found out, hour and a half, hour 45 minutes ago about the fight. So it was kind of a rush to get things ready, but I appreciate everybody making it over here. And it's always a good example that the church is the people. The church is not a building. The church can gather wherever the church wants to gather and still worship. And so this is, days like this are a good reminder of that. But Acts chapter 25, and so just by way of a little background here, obviously we know we've been making our way through the journey of Paul from the city of Jerusalem to the city of Rome. And God chose the means by which he got there to be imprisonment. And so he's been through various trials. He stood trial before the Sanhedrin. He stood trial before Felix, the governor of Judea, and then the governor of Judea changed to Festus, and he stood trial before Festus after 2 years in Caesarea. And so that's what we looked at last week. And so Festus, coming into this being new, not knowing the whole situation, just like everybody else who has looked at Paul, has seen nothing in him worthy of the situation that he's in. He has seen him break no law, and yet this curious thing happened that Paul appealed to Caesar. We saw that at the end of our text last week. And whereas that's significant, because again he's been in Caesarea for 2 years. As far as Paul's concerned, that's no progress that has been made to get to Rome. And so now he has to go to Rome because he's appealed to Caesar, which is his right as a Roman citizen to do so. But it puts Festus into this interesting situation where now the Paul problems is mostly out of his hands. Right? The Jews can't accuse him of saying, you sided with him. Paul can't accuse him of saying you sided with the Jews. All that's out of his hands. Paul's appealed to Caesar. The case itself is out of his hands. However, it puts him in an awkward position because now he has to send Paul to Nero, and he has no idea what to tell Nero. And so we'll see that in our text this morning, and the kind of the conundrum that Festus has found himself in. But let's take a look here, Acts 25, starting verse 13. We'll go to the end of the chapter. It says, "And after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to salute Festus. And when they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's cause unto the king, saying, There is a certain man left in bonds by Felix, about whom when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him, to whom I answered, It is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die, before that he which have accused him have the accusers face to face, and have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. Therefore, when they were come hither, without any delay on the morrow, I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought forth. Against whom the accusers stood up, they brought none accusation of such things as I supposed, but had certain questions against him of their own superstition, and of one Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem, and there be judged of these matters. But when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. And then Agrippa said unto Festus, I would hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, thou shalt hear him. And on the morrow, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice with great pomp, and was entered into the place of hearing, with the chief captains and the principal men of the city, at Festus' command Paul was brought forth. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, you see this man, about whom all the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I have determined to send him, of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Wherefore I have brought him forth before you, and especially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination I might have someone to write. For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. And so, here we have it. Again, the trials of Paul are continuing. And now he stands before yet another Roman official. And so this has been kind of par for the course for a while now. This particular time, amongst others, we'll see this later in the text, but the main person to which he's standing before will be King Agrippa and his sister Bernice. Now, our text begins with or rather it begins what is a really lengthy portion of the book of Acts. This section doesn't really end until chapter 26. It goes through all the way through the next chapter, and it's this trial, or really this hearing. It's not really accurate to call it a trial, but this hearing before King Agrippa. And so we see the build up to it in the next week, in chapter 26. We'll actually, at the very least, begin to look at Paul's defense. And so this particular time, it's interesting because there's no actual accusations laid against Paul during this text. This is simply a hearing for the purposes of Festus to gain information so that he can send off Paul, in his mind, properly, to send him to Nero with the proper instructions to Nero. But what it is going to lead to in verse 26 is the longest and most detailed defense given by Paul of himself. So we'll see that next week, and we'll see how he gets into the gospel and how he uses that opportunity to give the gospel. That's coming. And so, here at verse 13, the text begins with King Agrippa and his sister Bernice coming in verse 13 to salute Festus. Now, just a little historical background here. This Agrippa here is Herod Agrippa II. He is the last of the Herodian dynasty. And if you ever want just a crazy study, go study the Herods. It is an insane study to get into their lives, to get into their family tree, to get into the power that they had. It's difficult to keep it all together. There was a lot of, maybe the best way to say this, there's a lot of interconnectedness within that family tree. And so sometimes it's difficult to keep people in line as to who they are and who they married and the kids that they had. But it started with Herod the Great. And of course, Herod the Great was the Herod who was in control when Jesus was born. He's the one who tried to have, all the kids, or did have the kids in Bethlehem killed 2 and under. And then when he died, there was kind of his kingdom was split up between his sons, or at least some of his sons. And then down the line, we finally get to Herod Agrippa II. He is the great-grandson of King Herod the Great. He was the son of Herod Agrippa I. Herod Agrippa I was the one who had James killed, and who had Paul, or rather Peter, put into prison. And so just part of the family tree, this makes him and Bernice the siblings of Drusilla. You remember Drusilla? Drusilla was the wife of Felix. We saw that in the last chapter. And so they are all siblings. Now Agrippa was essentially the Jewish king. It refers to him here in the text as King Agrippa. And so it's an interesting title because Agrippa actually had less authority than Festus. Festus was the Roman governor of Judea. And so as the governor, he had basically full control over the area. And so Agrippa was essentially a Jewish king. He had control over certain Jewish matters. In fact, he was the superintendent of the temple. He controlled the things that went on as far as the physical structure. In fact, it was under Herod Agrippa II where the temple was finally completed in its, I guess you could say, its final form. Interestingly enough, just a few years before it was actually destroyed. But he was the superintendent of the temple. He was the one actually who had the final say in who was going to be the high priest. And so he had certain Jewish matters that he was in control of, but like I said, he had less authority than Festus. And so here he comes to basically make a relationship. Here's this guy, he's just been put into place, he's the new governor of Judea. Obviously, if you want to have a good, strong political alliance and relationship as King Herod, the governor of Judea is the guy you want to have a good, strong relationship with. And so he and his sister Bernice, and this is a long story, just to make it short, history, there's some debate on this, but it very seems strongly suggested that King Agrippa and his sister had a long-term incestuous relationship. In fact, she was married off several times, and every time the marriage broke off, she would always come running back to Agrippa. And it was kind of this, again, the Herods are just an interesting study for a lot of reasons. But he and his sister Bernice, they come to meet and build this relationship with Festus. And so it says, when they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's cause unto the king. And so this gave Festus the opportunity that he desperately wanted. He didn't seek this out. As far as we know, he didn't call for Agrippa and Bernice to come down, but this gave him the opportunity that he wanted. And so this is another good situation for Festus. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Paul had appealed to Caesar, which Festus would necessarily accommodate. again, there's nothing he could do but send Paul to Nero in this particular occasion. However, like I said, this puts him in an awkward position. Now, he's going to send a letter to Nero. We see this in verse 26 and verse 27. In verse 26 says, of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord being Nero. 27, he says, for it seemeth to me unreasonable to send this, Paul, with, I don't even know what to say. And so he's in this awkward position. And so he's going to have to send a letter to Nero, which essentially says that Paul has appealed to you, and I can't even write to you what law he has broken. And so he's going to have to send this letter that such as Claudius had sent to Felix. But the question is, what would it say? It would look really bad upon Festus to have a freeborn Roman citizen who had to appeal to Caesar because he was unable to get justice in his own province. Right? And that's essentially what's happening. Paul's not getting justice, so he had to appeal to Caesar, even though every time he stood before any Roman official or Jewish official even, they have declared him innocent. Nobody has ever found him guilty of any crime. And so if you were Festus, you know that looks bad. Not only have you just taken this position, but now you're sending a known innocent man to stand trial before Caesar, and not just a known innocent man, but a free-born Roman citizen who has not broken any Roman law, right? And so again, awkward position for Festus. And so he needed to make the case to sound justified, but he also knew the case was mostly about Jewish ideology, Jewish beliefs. And so Agrippa, this is where he comes in, because Agrippa is the Jewish king. Agrippa is a Jew. You could call him a practicing Jew, I guess. But he has an understanding of Jewish matters. He has an understanding of Jewish doctrine. And so if Festus believes there's just a difference of opinion amongst the Jews, and they don't like what Paul believes, Agrippa can come in and he can help him figure out, or best case scenario, maybe found out that he actually did break some kind of Jewish law, and then he has that to write to Nero. And so this is what Festus is hoping. And so Festus begins to fill in Agrippa on the whole case. He tells him that this prisoner was left to him by Felix, and then he says, whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews inform me, desiring to have judgment against him. And so what is interesting here is that Festus actually rightly frames the whole matter. He rightly frames the situation. This is a prisoner, speaking of Paul, this is a prisoner he inherited who the Sanhedrin once judged. Right? That's how he frames it. I inherited this prisoner, the Sanhedrin wants him judged. But notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, I've inherited this guilty man, and he's broken these laws, and the Sanhedrin rightly and justifiably wants him judged. That's not what he says, because he doesn't believe that to be true. And so, Festus tells Agrippa, and his response was, it is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die, before that he which is accused have the accusers face to face, and have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. And so, this is kind of a recap a little bit, but Festus had told the Jewish leaders, he can't condemn a man to death without a fair trial. And this is true. This was very built into the fabric of Roman law. Roman law, as far as the way that they ran their courts and things, is not completely dissimilar from the way that we do so. And so there were laws in place for this. He had to have a fair trial, which goes to show exactly what they had asked of Festus. Now, we didn't get this in as much detail earlier on in the chapter, but for Festus to have to tell the Jews, I can't just put a man to death with no trial, shows us that when they came to Festus, what they said was, just kill him. Right? That's what they wanted, just kill him. And Festus had to tell him, I can't just kill a man without trying him first. And so they didn't ask Festus for a trial. They didn't care about justice. All they wanted was for Paul to be dead, which Festus knows he cannot do under Roman law. And so Festus stuck to this, to his credit. He sticks to this, and when the Jews came to Caesarea, Festus has the trial the next day. We saw this last week. And so this is where Festus' interest in Agrippa becomes clear. During the trial, the Jews, he says, brought none accusation of such things as I supposed, but had certain questions against him, against Paul, of their own superstition, and of one Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. Now, we mentioned this last week, but they very clearly levied against Paul the same accusations that they had when he stood before Felix. And we know that because of Paul's response. However, it is very clear about what Festus says here, is that they have finally, seemingly, I guess you could say, dropped the pretense and said, yes, Paul is a mover of sedition, but what he's really done, what he's really done, why he's really deserving of death, is because of his beliefs, because of his theological doctrine, because of his theological understanding and his doctrine, his beliefs. And so they had now finally shown their true colors. All they really care about is what Paul believes theologically to be true. And it makes sense that they finally did this, because everybody knows at this point they can't prove that Paul had done anything worthy of death. Everybody has said so. And now, after trial after trial after trial, they have been unable to prove or even to provide so much as a single witness that Paul had done the things that they had claimed he'd done. And so now they finally just get down to brass tacks here and say, no, this is why he deserves to die, because he believes that Jesus rose again. This is the fundamental issue. And this is important for Christians to understand, because this is still the fundamental issue today. Right? Did Jesus rise from the dead? Our entire faith depends on it. Everything that we do as Christians is based on that fundamental truth. And so it was just as fundamental for Paul then. It's just as fundamental for Christians now. I'll quote Howard Marshall. He said, "It is interesting that by this stage, the question of Paul's alleged desecration of the temple has quite disappeared from sight, and the topic of the resurrection has replaced it. The real ground of dispute is that Paul preaches the resurrection of Jesus, something which the Sadducees refused to believe on principle, and which the Pharisees likewise refused to believe, although they admitted the fact of the final resurrection of all men." In other words, here's what he's saying. It didn't matter what Paul believed about the resurrection of Jesus. Just by the fact he believed in a resurrection at all, already put him on against the ideology of the Sadducees. The Pharisees agreed that there would be a general resurrection at the end of time, but the fact that Paul's now saying, hold on now, Jesus came to be the first fruits. Right? That's what he told the Corinthians. Jesus is the first fruits, and by the first fruits we have hope that we too will be resurrected one day. And so they denied the fact that Jesus was resurrected, even though they believed in a general resurrection. All of them could come together in their agreement that Paul's a heretic because he taught these things about Jesus. Now, Festus does not understand why this matters, and he's completely ignorant on this. He just doesn't get why any of this means anything to anybody. And so he tells Agrippa, he said, "Because I doubted of such manner of questions." Right? Paul's over here saying Jesus is alive. They're saying he's not. What difference does it make? That's what Festus is saying. I don't get this. I doubted of such manner of questions. He says, so I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judge of these matters. But when Paul had appealed to be observed in the hearing of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. And so Festus does not understand what's going on. He doesn't understand the gravity of the situation. He doesn't understand the importance of this particular doctrinal truth. And so even though, as I mentioned last week, he's very happy to be rid of Paul because it gets a headache off of his shoulders. Right? The Sanhedrin can leave him alone and he can just get Paul gone. He's happy with that part. But now, again, he's worried about sending Paul to Nero with a letter that essentially says, this guy has appealed to you, and here's what's going on. He believes that somebody is alive that they believe isn't. I mean, that's all he has to say to Nero. And so I was trying to think of just a way to illustrate kind of the absurdity in Festus's mind of this whole situation. Because here's why, again, this is what he's worried about. I'm going to have to send Nero a letter that says this is the reason why he's appealing to you, because of this one strange belief. And so I was trying to think of a way to illustrate this. And this is by no means a great illustration. This is what I came up with. And so suppose that, I'll just use my kids. Suppose that Isaiah and April were drawing a picture. And in this particular picture, they had drawn the sun. And Isaiah and April both got into a fight because Isaiah said the sun is orange, and April said, no, the sun is yellow. And they get into this big fight about it, and they can't come to an agreement, and they go to Micah, and Micah can't figure out what to do, and so he comes to me, because Isaiah says, well, if you can't figure this out, let's just go to Dad. And Micah comes to me and says, Dad, we have this huge issue, and none of us can figure it out. It's turned into a big argument, and you've got to figure out what to do here. And then he tells me, Isaiah thinks the sun is orange, April thinks the sun is yellow. I would probably look at Micah and say, I think this is something y'all can figure out on your own. And if you can't figure this out on your own, you need to figure out how to have a normal conversation with one another. I don't think this is a time where Judge Dad needs to come into play with such a trivial matter. Right? And so this is what Festus is thinking. I'm about to send this man to the most important man on the face of the earth with basically saying Paul thinks the sun is yellow and they think the sun is orange kind of problem. Now, that's what he thinks, but he doesn't understand how wrong he is. He doesn't understand, again, the fundamental problem in this particular issue. I'll quote Phillips here. He said, "Poor Festus, he had in his custody heaven's greatest ambassador, a man greater far than any Caesar of Rome or any philosopher of Greece. And Festus failed to see it. He was in touch with truths that are the most sublime in all the world, and he did not know it. Thus destiny and eternity came and knocked, but Festus could not be bothered to so much as go to the door." And so again, he doesn't understand the gravity of what he's being told. Now the Romans, generally speaking, didn't believe in the resurrection. And so Festus didn't understand the importance, but again, we know that for Paul it was everything. Festus maybe not have understood this, but for Paul, it was the very reason why he was there. It was the very reason why he could stand and endure. It's the very reason why he appealed to Caesar in the first place, because he needed to go to Rome to tell people about the Jesus who resurrected and was alive again. And so Paul told the Corinthians, he says, "And if Christ be not raised, your faith is vain, you are yet in your sins, and then they which also are fallen asleep in Christ are perished." And so Paul tells the Corinthians the resurrection of Christ is the only thing that gives us hope, and it's the only thing that gives us hope for those who have already died. Right? The resurrection of Christ means everything to us. Literally, eternity rests upon the truth that Jesus Christ lived, died, and lives again. Everything that we believe rests upon that truth. It is the most important fundamental doctrine for Christianity. And so the resurrection was not just a theological disagreement. This is not a case where Christians can agree to disagree. If you don't believe in the resurrection, you are not a Christian, and you cannot make a claim to be one. Right? And this is not just some tertiary doctrine where we might have differences of interpretations based upon unclear biblical passages. No, that's not the case. The Bible tells us fundamentally that Jesus rose again. It is the very source of our hope in Christ. And for Paul, like I said, it was what made him more than willing to endure this current situation. And so if Paul didn't believe in the resurrection, he would have gotten out of there long before this. Right? But no, he was able to endure because the resurrection was the source of his faith and the source of his hope, and it led him to say, if you want me to go to Rome by this road, let me go to Rome in chains. Because those people need to hear about the resurrection. Now this was all enough to pique the curiosity of Agrippa. Agrippa says that he really wants to see Paul for himself. And this probably thrilled Festus. And so Festus agrees to bring Paul the following day. Now, I just want to point this out. I've been trying to do this as we've gone throughout this whole trial system. But we've seen some parallels already between the trials of Jesus and the trials of Paul. And there's a couple other interesting ones here. And I want to note too, and there's going to be another one later. But Jesus and Paul were both questioned by the governor of Judea and a Herod. They were both questioned by a governor of Judea and a Herod. For Jesus, the governor was Pilate, and it was Herod Antipas, Agrippa's uncle. For Paul, it was Felix and Festus, both of them governor of Judea, and the nephew of Antipas, Herod Agrippa II. So they were both questioned by a governor and a Herod. Furthermore, the verb "I would" in verse 22, when Herod says, "I would also hear the man myself," the verb "I would" there, just as far as the Greek is concerned, is in the imperfect tense. And by the verb being in an imperfect Greek tense, that means it's an ongoing action. And so, essentially what that means is when Herod says, "I'd like to see this guy," he's not saying, "I've never heard of this before, and now, hearing this for the first time, I'd like to see this guy." No, this has been an ongoing thing. Herod Agrippa knows who Paul is. It just makes sense. He's king of the Jews. He knows who Paul is. And so, essentially what he's saying is, I've been wanting to see this guy. Right? I really have been wanting to see Paul, which again is very much in line with Jesus' trial, where we read in Luke 23, and when Herod, and this is Antipas, Agrippa's uncle, and when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracles done by him. And so again, the parallels are there, and it's very strange to see almost exactly some of the things that happened to Jesus are now happening to Paul. Like I said, we'll see another one here in just a moment. And so on the next day, Festus turns this whole event into a spectacular thing. And so verse 23 says, "And on the morrow, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice, with great pomp." And in fact, interestingly enough, I didn't know this until this past week, that word pomp there is the Greek word fantasia. And so if you know the old Disney movie Fantasia, it's this, it's a strange thing, but pomp would kind of well describe the movie. That's this Greek word, pomp, fantasia. And so there was a lot of pomp going on. And so Festus made this an event. He made this something that you would want to be a part of, and we see that many were. And so beyond the ones we know, Festus, Agrippa, Bernice, they're all there. But beyond that, we see that there were chief captains. Chief captains. Now, just from a historical perspective, we know that Caesarea, as the capital of Judea, had stationed there 5 of these captains. Now, these men held the same position as Claudius Lysias that we saw from a few chapters ago, meaning each one of these men would be in charge of 1,000 soldiers. They had 1,000 men under them. And so these 5 chief captains are there, likely with some of their soldiers in tow. And then beyond them, it just simply lists the principal men. The principal men of the city were there, verse 23. And so essentially what Luke is telling us here is that anyone who was anyone in the city of Caesarea was there for this particular meeting. And so anybody who had any kind of pedigree was there. And it was into this veritable lion's den that Festus has Paul brought. Now, it seems as if Luke is trying to really set a picture in our mind. And so you can imagine what he's done here as he has juxtaposed Agrippa and Bernice and Festus, the chief captains, all the principal men of the city. You can imagine just all these people with great pomp, right? And you can imagine King Herod coming up and his regalia and his finery, and his sister Bernice, and she was known to be an incredibly rich woman. And so you can imagine the kind of finery that she was wearing, and all that was happening on kind of this side of the room with all the riches and the bureaucracy and the government officials and just high class citizenry. And then in walks just this singular, lonely prisoner who's been in prison for 2 years. Now, yes, I understand he had a lot of freedom. Paul had a lot of freedom, but that doesn't mean he's been able to go out and do whatever he wanted to do. And so in walks Paul against the kind of the ideal of riches. And also I want to add to this, Paul, and this is just my own thought on this. The Bible doesn't tell us this. But Paul, by this particular point, has endured so much physically. You go read 2 Corinthians, and shipwrecks, and beatings, and whippings. We've seen in the book of Acts where he was stoned to the point where they thought he was dead. Stoned to the point where those stoning him to stop because they thought, there's no way this guy's still alive. And I've talked about this in the past. I think that he was probably near blind. I think he had very, very bad eyesight. And I think there's a lot of proof of that in the New Testament. And so here walks this singular Christian man who's probably, again, my opinion, probably very broken physically. I think this is a broken man physically. In fact, you go read the book of Corinthians, and Paul gives the impression that he wasn't this imposing figure, right? He tells the Corinthians, "I came to you in weakness," right? And I'm not this great orator. I'm not going to overly impress people. If they look at Paul, the last thing you're going to think is this, that's an impressive man. And so here you have that juxtaposed against, again, all the regalia and the finery and the riches and the positions and the titles and all the authority over here against this one singular man over here. But what they're going to find out, and we'll see this next week, at least begin to see it. But what they're going to find out is where he may not have been imposing physically, that man was a spiritual giant. And they were about to find that out in great manner with his defense. Now, before Paul actually gets a chance to speak, like again, we'll see that next week, Festus gets up and he kind of announces a few things to the crowd. And in doing so, as I close with this, in doing so, he kind of makes 3 points that are going to be helpful actually to Paul. 3 points that are kind of helpful to Paul's defense. And so, verse 24 says, "And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, you see this man, about whom all this multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. And I'll pause it there for a moment. And so it seems as if Festus is kind of making the same observation that I just made. Look at this guy. This is the guy that they're making all this fuss about. Just look, do you think that's the guy? And so he's pointing out Paul's, I guess you could say, weakness. But Festus makes it clear, and this is what I mean by this helpful to Paul. Festus makes it clear that the reason Paul is in the position he's in had nothing to do with the things that Paul had done. It had everything to do with the fact that the Jews thought he ought not to live any longer. Now again, he doesn't say, because of what he's done, justice says he ought not to live any longer. That's not what he said. He said, look at this guy. The Jews don't think he should live. That's what he said. And so again, he's kind of really placing things on the line here. Now, I've mentioned this a couple times through the study. We know that God was using this whole situation to bring about his will. But that does not negate the sinfulness of those involved, or does it negate the lack of justice taking place? Right? Just because God was using this situation to get Paul to Rome doesn't mean that the Jews get a free pass because of their sinfulness. It doesn't mean, well, I guess if it got Paul to Rome, I guess we could say that justice really happened. No. This was an incredible lack of justice. There was an incredible amount of sin. God is just able, and he can and does do this, to use the sinfulness of man to bring about his will. And this is exactly what happened with Jesus on the cross. Right? Did that negate the Jewish, the sins of the Jewish leaders as they're crying out, crucify him and let his sins be upon us and upon our children? Absolutely not. They go to the grave with that sin upon them. Again, assuming they never repented and turned to Christ. But this is something that God can and does do. Use the sinfulness of people to bring about his will. And this is what he's doing with Paul. And so Festus goes on to say, he said, but when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself had appealed unto Augustus, I have determined to send him. And so contrary to what the Jews thought, again, what did he say? The Jews say he ought not to live any longer. What does Festus say? I haven't found that he's done anything worthy of death. Right? Nobody has found that he's done anything worthy of death. And so contrary to the opinion of the Jews, Festus has seen nothing within Paul that would warrant the punishment that they're seeking for. Now this is the second time that a high-ranking Roman official has stated that they have seen Paul do nothing, quote, worthy of death. It's the exact same phrase that Claudius wrote in his letter to Felix. Claudius said, I have seen nothing in him worthy of death. Festus here says, I have seen nothing in him worthy of death. And of course, this all makes sense for Luke to include this in his defense of Paul, that is the book of Acts. And again, I mentioned earlier there would be another similarity. This is the exact same phrase, interestingly enough, the exact same phrase Pilate used of Jesus in what is a similar setting. Not the exact same setting, but a similar one. And so Luke tells us that in Luke 23 that Pilate called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people. In other words, there's a great crowd. The chief priests are there, and so it's not quite the regalia that is happening right now with Paul, but there's still some important people who have been called together, and during that meeting, it says that Pilate said, nothing worthy of death is done unto him. And so he uses that exact same phrase for Jesus. Again, the governor of Judea says nothing was worthy of done of death in Jesus. The governor of Judea, again, is saying nothing worthy of death has been done in Paul. And so finally, he ends with his current dilemma. And this is what this whole section has been about. Of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord, wherefore I have brought him before you, and especially before you, O King Agrippa, that after examination I might have somewhat to write. For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not withal signify the crimes laid against him. And so this whole scenario, everything about this, Festus says there in verse 27, it seems to him to be an unreasonable situation. He's right, it is. It is an unreasonable situation. Never has, outside of the whole ordeal with Christ, have we seen just time and time and time again somebody be called innocent over and over and over again, and yet people still calling for them to die. Now, we've seen innocent people be thrown in jail. We've seen things like that happen, but we're talking about somebody who over and over and over at every level has been called innocent. The people who had the authority to squash the whole thing are saying he's innocent, and yet he remains detained. and yet he remains a prisoner. And so again, it is very obvious to see the hand of God upon all of this. It's so obvious to see God getting Paul to Rome by this particular means. And so he's about, and I mentioned this earlier, but he's about as a freeborn Roman citizen to stand before Nero, whom he knows is innocent. Right? And so this is the absurdity of this whole ordeal. And this is why he was so pleased to have Agrippa. He hoped that he would be able to shed some light on the theological and the ideological side of the Jews, hoping beyond hope that Paul had done something worthy to write about. Now he knew, it didn't matter what I find, it won't be worthy of the punishment they're trying to get, which is death. I will not find anything that would justify a death penalty, but maybe I can find something that this guy has done that I could write in there that would justify, at least to some degree, me sending this man to stand before Nero. And so Festus here is desperately grasping for straws, trying to find anything he could to levy against Paul before sending a man to stand before Nero with not a single charge laid before him. And so again, this is all kind of a setup for chapter 26 and this lengthy defense that Paul is going to give for himself. And so as we close this morning, again, we see Paul in what I will label an interesting situation. A very interesting situation. As I was thinking about this, almost, if we didn't have the scriptures, if we didn't have Holy Spirit inspired scripture writing for us this story and telling us specifically that Jesus appeared to Paul and said, as you testified to me in Jerusalem, you're going to testify to me in Rome. If we didn't have that, almost anybody looking at Paul would say he's in a desperate and hopeless situation. He's in a situation where time after time he should have been let go, and yet for some unthinkable reason he's still there. For some unthinkable reason he's still in bonds. He's still in prison. He's still not free to leave. And so everybody looking at this would say this is a travesty of justice. This is not right what's taking place to Paul. Again, this is desperate. This is hopeless. He's been in prison. He's been detained, even though every time he's ever stood before trial, he's been claimed as innocent. However, what man sees as desperate and hopeless, God sovereignly controls to bring about his will. And this is what's so amazing about these last several chapters of the book of Acts, is because we see a man whom is being just led through the ringer, and not a shred of justice is done for Paul in these last several chapters of the book of Acts. And yet, throughout the whole ordeal, we see God sovereignly moving to get the gospel from Jerusalem all the way to Rome. And think about the importance of the gospel being in Rome. I mean, we just to look at it from a historical perspective, there's really no way to overemphasize the global implications and the historical implications of the gospel going to Rome. Again, we're not just talking about one empire amongst many. We're talking about the empire at the time, and we're talking about the gospel infiltrating the very heart and center of that empire. It would be just within a few hundred years where the gospel would just take off. We understand that, and within a few hundred years, as the gospel is legal, Christianity is legalized in Rome, and eventually we have a Christian emperor, and Bibles are being made, and Christianity is flourishing and going out over the world. That doesn't mean it didn't face persecution. It did. We understand that. It's always faced persecution. But God God knows what he is doing, and he knows where the gospel needs to go, and he knows where it's going to have the most impact. And Rome at this particular time was the place for the gospel to go. And so he got his best missionary there. He got the one who would have the most impact there. Now, again, as I've said this so many times, we could sit back and say, well, God, isn't there a bunch of different ways you could have gotten them there? And the answer to that is yes. There are a bunch of different ways God could. There was an infinite number of ways that God could have gotten them there. But you know what? God knows what's best. God knows what's right. God knows what's holy. And he will only do what is best and right and holy. And this is the way that God deemed to get Paul there to have the best impact. And so, again, I say, what man sees as desperate and hopeless, God sovereignly controls to bring about his will. And, lest we forget, the Bible tells us in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, that God's will is good and acceptable and perfect. It is good and acceptable and perfect. And so because Paul believed in Jesus, because Paul believed in the resurrection of Christ, even if he didn't know all that God was doing, and I would submit there, I think it's highly likely that he did not. Even if he didn't know everything that God was doing, he did know, as he wrote to the Romans, that if we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. Let's pray.